Hello, and welcome to a new podcast series by the local charity, the Energy and Sustainability Centre, also known as ESC. We have crafted 5 exciting episodes to educate the island on its journey to net zero. This series is generously sponsored by Zurich on the Isle of Man, and we're thrilled to get started. In today's episode, we're joined by 2 distinguished guests, Charlotte Lewis from Deloitte, whose expertise in sustainability and business strategy brings a critical perspective on how nature and sustainability are intertwined with corporate responsibility. And Makepeace-Warne from the Manx Wildlife Trust, a passionate advocate for wildlife conservation and a key figure in promoting biodiversity on the Isle of Man.
So I think climate went first after it garnered the most attention since the year since the Paris Agreement. But I think it's realised now that our environment's made up of a lot more than that, and it's increasingly apparent that the environmental crisis that we face requires like a climate and nature joint transition. So what I mean by that is a transition to an economy that's not only consistent with net zero carbon emissions, but is also nature positive. And when you look at the why, so why is that so important? The World Economic Forum issues global risk reports each year, and for the last 5 years, biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse has been present in the top 5 risks. It's also been estimated that 44 trillion of economic value generation is moderately or highly dependent on nature and its services. There's been some really interesting recent first of its kind analysis as well by the Green Finance Institution in April of this year that looked at the impact that the degradation of nature on the UK economy and financial sector. So the University of Oxford and University of Reading looked at kind of the impact on the financial services sector, and in short, the deterioration of the natural environment could lead to an estimated loss of 12% of GDP. And actually, when you consider like the impact of the global financial crisis of 2008 and COVID-19, how does that compare? Well, the global financial crisis was took off 5% of GDP in the UK, and COVID-19 took 11% of UK GDP. So it's really significant. And I think, there's a real clear link between investment risk and the degradation of nature and climate risks. But it's not just all about the risk, it's also the opportunity. So there's many opportunities in valuing nature when making decisions for businesses. I think it's something like 1.7 trillion is the average annual spend expected on physical assets needed between 2020 and 2050 to reach net zero. So if you think about how much sustainable finance is needed in that regard, there's a huge opportunity for investors to make returns.
So Graham, from the Manx Wildlife Trust point of view, or an NGO body like that, how does it actually practically work wildlife and the economy working together?
Yeah, obviously I don't have the financial and business understanding that Charlotte's got, which is incredible. But in real terms, why does a company like Aviva pledge a huge amount of money, like £38 million, to restore temperate rainforests across the temperate rainforest zone in the British Isles? So that's, all around the Irish Sea, of which, we in the Isle of Man are benefiting from that scheme. And it's because they're all about risk. They know that with climate change, there's going to be more flooding, more stormy weather. There's going to be more insurance claims as a result of that. There's going to be more crop failures. Food security is going to be an issue. They're looking long range into the future and seeing these issues coming, and they're trying to mitigate that. And that, I think, is a really good example of what needs to happen across the board. And to make that happen, we're not just going to be able to rely on people doing it voluntarily like Aviva. We're going to need legislation that's going to drive that. And some of it is coming in. We've got ESG, which Charlotte's mentioned already, the environmental, social and governance side of things. But we need other stuff as well, like biodiversity net gain, which they have in the UK, like nutrient neutrality, which they have in places in the UK they're trialling, and is working really well to bring money into conservation to help undo and mitigate some of the issues caused historically by business, but also, again, as Charlotte says, to turn it into an opportunity to something positive going forward.
Think there's any specific challenges we're looking at, sort of anything which really stands out, or is it sort of across the board when it comes to working this balance between economy, working with businesses, and obviously the environment, and in the island's case, the biosphere and such like?
I think there are definitely those who feel there is a risk in monetising nature, putting a price on nature. Personally, I think it's a positive thing to do. If we look at nature's capital, ecosystem services, clearly nature drives our economy. We just haven't seen it that way before. And when we start to put the two things together, I mean, look at how much green prescribing and people getting out into nature can save the NHS in terms of money. We know that time in nature is great for physical and mental health. Ecotourism as well. In time, I can see the Isle of Man being a fantastic place for wildlife and ecotourism. We just need to invest in the right sort of areas. And I've mentioned biodiversity net gain already, nutrient neutrality as well. I mean, a few weeks ago I was at the Wildlife Trust conference in Hampshire and Isle of Wight, where they're doing nutrient neutrality. And the money that's coming in from that, which is paid by developers who want to build houses in that area, is allowing the Wildlife Trust there to build up swathes of land either side of the water catchment area, turn them into nature reserves, which is then catching that water runoff from agricultural land and from development, and before it gets into the sea. And that's solving massive issues for wildlife and biodiversity. It's creating great places for nature, but also, really importantly for me, great places for people to spend time in and enjoy. And that all comes back to those businesses and people and nature all thriving together.
Now, you mentioned the biosphere there. This is one that could go to either of you, really, but other jurisdictions, we know about the biosphere on the Isle of Man. It's been heavily promoted the last several years as the Isle of Man as a unique biosphere nation state. What are other jurisdictions doing to value nature that the Isle of Man biosphere could maybe emulate?
A good example that I usually reference is there was a report done by Deloitte in Australia that valued the Great Barrier Reef. And it valued it at 56 billion, contributing around 6.4 billion in terms of the value that's added to the economy on an annual basis, and as well as supporting and creating 64,000 direct and indirect jobs. So there's lots of different ways you can value nature or place value on nature. Whether that's carbon sequestration per square mile or how much you would pay to people to visit glens, for example. But I think when you do place a value on nature, in that example of the report, it does make businesses, governments, NGOs to kind of make informed business decisions based on the impact on nature, and actually the cost or opportunity cost of not kind of using nature to I suppose invest appropriately. Costa Rica's another good example. So they've been kind of a pioneer in valuing nature. They had around in the 1980s such an impact on unsustainable land use practices that they only had 20% of forests remaining. And they've done a lot since the 1980s and had kind of a pioneering programme of what's called payments for ecosystem services, which has reduced biodiversity loss and it extended the forest's carbon sequestration capacity. Things like debt for nature swaps, so they'll have a kind of a financial mechanism that involves the exchange of a country's foreign debt for local currency investments in conservation. They'll also do pay people, such as farmers and landowners, for ecosystem services, which obviously forces people because they get rewarded in a monetary way, but just has meant that they've now become a bit of a global leader in sustainable practices and ecotourism. So I think the Isle of Man, given that it is, a huge part of our lives here, being the world's only entire nation biosphere, has a real opportunity to use that status as a test bed for nature restoration initiatives.
And any thoughts from you, Graham, on that one?
Yeah, I think we're extremely lucky in the Isle of Man to be the world's only whole nation biosphere, and I think in some ways we do it really, really well. And many other biospheres are just run by groups of volunteers, charities. Here it's part of government, so it's great that it's intertwined within our sort of governmental processes like that. But then the downside of that is that a lot of people then see it as a status that's kind of handled by government, and therefore it should affect a lot of decision making processes, and things shouldn't be done that might affect our status as a biosphere, and that's not really what it's about. I think it's evolving now into we are all the biosphere, and it's about all our decision making processes and how we can do things better. And I don't think we're at risk of losing our biosphere status, but I do think we need, as an island, to look more closely at how we can work together, people, business, nature, to thrive. And, renewable energy, dealing with climate change is going to be a key part of that.
We mentioned the biosphere there, and obviously a part of that, and something that your work and the work of the Manx Wildlife Trust is widely seen across the island, with protected areas, nature reserves. They're always growing. We've got the marine nature reserves as well. What sort of part would you say that plays in actually conserving biodiversity?
The greatest way that we can protect wildlife is by protecting its habitats. So protected areas are the single most effective way to protect nature. And we're doing okay. We've got 25 ASSIs in the Isle of Man, areas of special scientific interest. We've got one Ramsar site, which is an internationally recognised site. We've got multiple wildlife sites. We've got 10 marine nature reserves, so you could argue we're leading the way in terms of marine protected areas. We've got an area of special protection for birds. We've got 5 bird sanctuaries. We've got, what are we on now, 29 nature reserves at Manx Wildlife Trust. There's also the Manx Birdlife Reserve up in the north of the island. So there are some really good protected sites. However, government does have a mandate to create more ASSIs, and they're behind on that schedule. So that is something that they could move forward. And also, protected land isn't always perfect. ASSIs, there isn't the resourcing within government to properly police ASSIs. So development and work that damages ASSIs does still happen and doesn't necessarily get, properly dealt with. That's why we feel, and we're still very interested in creating more nature reserves, because we know that as part of a trust, as a charity, that land will be held in perpetuity for nature. But even then, we've been doing that for over 50 years and we're still losing species. So it's got to be protecting land in combination with lots of other work that's going to have the biggest effect.
And that's something, certainly I've noticed, Charlotte, over the years. You see more and more companies like Deloitte, maybe KPMG, a lot of the companies based on the Isle of Man. You see a lot of them getting involved in sort of volunteer work and teams going out from companies to actually go and do work as sort of days out, their bonding days from the company's point of view, and also carrying out great work on the reserves.
Yeah, and I think, that's also because, it's the demands that come as well from people that work for these companies as well. So, there's an expectation now that people don't want to work for companies that don't care. And I'm not saying that they necessarily didn't care before, but it's a real important factor for people to consider when they, select where they want to work. And that goes beyond just volunteering. That's also in terms of their scope 1, 2 emissions, with regards to their reporting on that as well, and tracking it. So I think it's only kind of positive as the kind of generation it kind of moves through into more decision making positions as well within businesses.
Can I just add a point on that as well? Because I did mention 30 by 30, which is it's actually mandated at a global level, 30 by 30. So 30 by 30 is the idea that we protect 30% of our territorially controlled land and seas by 2030, which is not that far away now. And we're on our way to doing it. I think the Isle of Man Biodiversity Strategy, which finishes next year in 25, that aims to have 20% of land with a statutory designation by 2025. They wanted to do 10% of marine nature reserves by 2020, which I think they're most of the way to doing that. But there is a lot more that can be done. that kind of legislation and kind of mandated work to create more space for nature is going to have a huge impact on both wildlife but also people.
So corporate reporting, you had mentioned earlier on, I think, at the beginning of the talk, Charlotte. So how is that actually working with regards to the landscape and nature? Because again, it's something which wouldn't necessarily, a lot of people outside of business might not necessarily put in the same bag.
Yeah, so today there's currently no mandatory regulation or standards that mandates nature from a corporate reporting or disclosure requirement, which is unlike the kind of growing and evolving mandatory reporting landscape for climate-related risks and emissions. So people might have heard of the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosures and International Sustainability Standards Board, as well as the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which has been really significant for EU and further non-EU companies too, to report on their emissions. But as it stands, there's no mandatory reporting for nature. However, there are a number of emerging frameworks, including the suitably named Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures, and existing standards, especially under the EU directive, are starting to call out the interaction of climate and nature. So the specific standards now that companies that are caught by the EU directive will have to report on. So European Sustainability Reporting Standards, they're always a bit of a mouthful, but ESRS, there's E1, which includes wording on nature, there's one on pollution, marine and water resources, and biodiversity and ecosystems. And what that all means is that I suppose companies that are caught by these mandatory regulations are going to have to start reporting on at least their risks in these areas and their impact on. So even though there's no mandatory reporting requirements at the minute, I think the direction of travel is that, it's a few years away, but certainly the large and listed companies will have to start reporting on their impact on nature.
I think I would probably just want to finish off by saying that there's a huge opportunity here for the island. This is about money. That is the way the world is run now, money. And there's a huge opportunity here for us to bring more money into the island. I know of at least one example of a huge global IT company wanting to build data centres in the Isle of Man. They've looked at it twice now, and both times they've decided against it because they can't meet their ESG requirements because there's no renewable energy available on island. So we're losing money as an island because of our current sort of track record on a lot of this stuff, and I think we have to look hard at that, fix that, and create these opportunities for these companies to come here, because things are going to change. It's going to become harder and harder to be a tax haven. It's going to become harder and harder for the TT to be viable, which is very sad for me. I love the TT almost as much as I love wildlife. We need to look at ways that we can mitigate for those risks and change things going forward, and create those opportunities to keep the island a place that is successful and thriving, as I keep saying, for both people and wildlife.
Do you see as a sea change within business, Charlotte, this idea now of much more of perhaps in the past there hadn't really been that link between nature and the environment, businesses, they've been two separate entities. Do you see going forward that they're very much more now working collaboratively?
Yeah, and just I suppose in relation to that point and what Graham was just saying, I think there's always a lot around like the negative side of things and the impact and the risk and stuff, but actually there is this huge opportunity where if you think 48% of the Isle of Man's GDP is in financial services, and there's this huge investment opportunity in sustainable investment. Actually, we live in this biosphere, the world's only entire nation biosphere, and have a significant financial services sector. It seems like the two should be redefine the relationship between nature and finance. It's happening elsewhere, and I think you're right, Graham, to call out the opportunity for our jurisdiction.